In the work he did, the words he spoke, and the life he lived, Bill Fulbright stood against the 20th century's most destructive forces and fought to advance its brightest hopes.
In a lifetime of service to his country, J. William Fulbright spoke to the nation's conscience, confronting Joseph McCarthy, promoting a visionary student exchange program, and challenging the war in Southeast Asia. Fulbright's life and ideas remain among the most significant in American political history. Despite his distinction as one of the 20th century's most influential political figures, J.W. Fulbright often referred to himself as a simple hillbilly from the Ozarks. J. William Fulbright was born in Missouri in 1905, and within the year his family was on the move. His father, Jay, was a businessman looking for opportunities. Jay packed up his family, crossed into the Ozark Mountains, and settled in the town of Fayetteville, Arkansas. This setting fit the Fulbrights well. The family lived in a stately home overlooking the University of Arkansas campus. Bill Fulbright grew to consider this his true home for the rest of his life. At age 16, Fulbright entered the University of Arkansas as a member of the class of 1924. He became student body president and a homegrown football star. He delighted the fans with the winning field goal in the homecoming game against Southern Methodist University. But 2 years later, tragedy hit the Fulbright family. Jay Fulbright died suddenly, leaving Bill fatherless, with control of the family in the hands of his mother, Roberta. Roberta Fulbright was the strongest influence in Bill's life. After her husband died, she successfully ran the family businesses, taking particular interest in the newspaper. In 1924, Fulbright graduated from the University of Arkansas and earned the chance to study in Oxford, England, as the recipient of a prestigious Rhodes Scholarship.
I grew up in Fayetteville, it was a little town of about 6,000 in those days, and I didn't know anything about it. I'd never been abroad. I'd never been to New York or Washington or San Francisco, even in this country. And it was a terrific experience to suddenly be in Oxford.
Fulbright began his studies at Oxford in the fall of 1925. 3 years that he later called the most wonderful time of my life. At Oxford's Pembroke College, Fulbright displayed impressive athletic ability, competing successfully in 3 sports and even earning a position on the international lacrosse team that toured the United States in the summer of 1926. He joined a social club, the Teasel, where he learned to drink and smoke, and was tapped as the only American member of the prestigious Johnson Club. Fulbright's family joined him at his Oxford graduation, and his mother encouraged him to take time to travel through Europe, where he met Michael Fodor.
And I ran into Fodor, and he was a very distinguished journalist. And he took me with him as a sort of an informal assistant, which enabled me to go to meetings with him. And I got acquainted, I don't mean personally, but I observed his meetings with some of the important politicians throughout the Middle Balkans.
And he recognized the value and the importance of this kind of experience, of being exposed to other cultures and other peoples, of seeing things through the eyes of others, seeing things as others might see them.
Fulbright returned to the United States, a well-educated and well-traveled young man, but with no definite plan of action. On a visit to Washington, D.C., Fulbright met Betty Williams, an outgoing young lady from a prosperous Philadelphia family, and a courtship ensued. In the summer of 1932, Betty Williams and Bill Fulbright married, and Bill enrolled at George Washington Law School. After graduating second in his class, he took a job teaching law at George Washington. Fulbright worked for a time at the U.S. Department of Justice before the couple moved to Fayetteville so he could teach at the University of Arkansas. The move allowed Bill to be closer to his mother and to lend a hand with the family businesses. Along with his teaching and work for his mother, he became a father with the arrival of his and Betty's first child. The family grew to include 2 daughters, Betsy and Roberta. By all accounts, Fulbright was happy and content. In September 1939, the president of the University of Arkansas was killed in a car crash. Roberta Fulbright's friend, Governor Carl Bailey, appointed Bill the school's new and very young president. Fulbright rebutted those who believed he was too young for the job with his trademark wit. "I really mean no offense by it," he said of his age, "but I am confident that definite progress is being made every day to correct it." Upon election as governor of Arkansas, Homer Adkins, a frequent target of Roberta Fulbright's caustic editorials, promptly fired the young university president.
So he had the board remove me, and that was all right. I really wasn't too disturbed because I had moved down there and had a nice country house and was interested in raising cattle, etc. And I wasn't too disturbed. Then one of my students, Clyde Ellis, came along and said, "Why don't you run for Congress?" So I did. I was out of a job. I didn't have anything particular, and it was interesting. Anyway, we had a very vigorous race, and I won it for the House.
Fulbright ran for Congress as an underdog. He set out in an old Ford pickup, traveling to country stores, farms, barnyards, and rallies.
It was fun to do because in our state it was small and rural with a great oral tradition of storytelling and listening. And you were supposed to get out and stir around. You had to actually, if you wanted to get elected to something, you couldn't just run television ads. You had to actually go out and meet people.
In November 1941, J. William Fulbright won a seat in the 78th United States Congress. Betty and Bill packed their bags. They were headed back to Washington. Fulbright took his seat as a freshman congressman amid the erupting chaos and conflict of World War II. The war and its aftermath provided the perfect stage for the independent-spirited, internationally minded Arkansan. Fulbright quickly made a name for himself as a legislator by introducing a resolution that led to the formation of the United Nations. Wary of the public's isolationist stance before the war, Fulbright was reassured by the supportive mail and phone calls that flooded his office. The Fulbright Resolution was overwhelmingly approved by Congress in late 1943, paving the way for the creation of the United Nations. Fulbright was happy that he had made a mark on international affairs so quickly, and in the process had dispelled myths about the inability of first-term House members to get things done. Everybody assumed that just because a fellow comes from Arkansas, he couldn't read or write, Fulbright said. But that's where they were wrong. In 1945, Arkansas Governor Homer Adkins again presented a challenge by running for the U.S. Senate. After 2 impressive terms in the House, Fulbright turned his eyes to this even bigger prize and attempted to settle an old score in the bargain.
So I decided to run against him, and that was a very hot race. And I won it and was there 30 years. That's how I got in. I had no intention of being in politics in the beginning. And nobody in my family had ever run for office. My father was a farmer and then a businessman. So it was just one of those accidents.
In the summer of 1945, Fulbright's efforts on behalf of a worldwide organization of nations came to fruition as representatives of 50 countries gathered in San Francisco to draft the United Nations Charter that his resolution had called for. The creation of the United Nations was a triumph for Fulbright, as shown by President Truman's enthusiastic support.
If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace.
To press the momentum of the UN's formation, Fulbright envisioned a new international scholarship program. He devised a plan whereby the United States agreed to forego the debts foreign countries amassed during the war in return for funding to create an educational exchange program.
So he has an idea, and he introduces a little sort of devilishly simple resolution that you take this material, this surplus material, the debts, and you trade it in, and you get the United States to forego the debts and finance an exchange program. That is to bring people together around the world. The United States will finance people coming here and back and forth. And it was done so nobody even paid any attention. I went back and looked at the papers at the time. It was just a little resolution, and it sounded like some of the most boring, obscure possible thing in the world. There wasn't a single note in the papers in Washington about this resolution. But out of that came the most extraordinary exchange program, literally in the history of the world.
When I first became head of the Fulbright Association, the first thing I asked him was, how on earth did you think of this program? What was going on in your head? And he said, you know, I was a Rhodes Scholar, and I know how much it transformed my life. So right after we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I held hearings in the Senate to find out the long-term effects of this radiation and this extraordinary new bomb. And what I heard was so horrifying that I spent the next several months trying to figure out how I was going to help prevent World War III. And it became clear to me that if we could persuade young potential leaders to go to another country for long enough to have to confront the culture and to really learn a different way of being, then when they really became leaders, they would be more inclined to exchange ideas instead of bullets.
On August 1st, 1946, President Truman signed the Fulbright Act, creating what became the largest educational exchange program in history. The Fulbright name was soon recognized the world over, associated with the cause of understanding and peace between nations. The Senator's efforts on behalf of peaceful international relations were challenged in the following years. In 1950, Fulbright was critical of the United States' entry into the Korean conflict. He was concerned that Cold Warriors, in their zeal to combat communism, were undermining many of the values they were pledged to preserve. We may find someday, without quite knowing when or how or why it happened, Fulbright stated, that we have destroyed our own constitutional democracy in order to save it. To Fulbright, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin came to embody this threat to American democracy. In a 1953 Senate appropriation hearing, McCarthy threatened to kill funding for the Fulbright Scholarship Program, charging the exchange program educated communists. Fulbright replied that he had come prepared to insert into the record thousands of statements from Fulbright scholars that refuted McCarthy's charges. Flustered by Fulbright's poise and defiance, the senator from Wisconsin unleashed a barrage of taunts at the man he now called Senator Half-Bright. But McCarthy withdrew his demands and never again challenged the Fulbright Scholarship Program. In February 1954, the Senate approved continued funding of McCarthy's subcommittee by a vote of 85-1. The lone vote against McCarthy was cast by Senator J. William Fulbright of Arkansas.
If this country cannot destroy this senator's influence, I see no real future for it because it will undermine the very moral basis of our kind of government.
Fulbright's views were not always popular, but he had become a respected voice in the Senate on international affairs. In 1959, Lyndon Johnson, the majority leader, persuaded Theodore Green, the aging chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, to step down. After 15 years in the Senate, Fulbright became the committee's new chairman, and with this post and power, one of the world's most influential men. In contrast to Fulbright's strong leadership in international affairs, the volatile issue of civil rights in America found him less at ease. In response to the 1954 Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, senators from southern states put forward the Southern Manifesto, a document declaring their unwillingness to abide by the order to integrate public schools. Fulbright wanted to dissent and contemplated breaking publicly with the Southern Bloc over the issue. But he feared that such a stand would inevitably lead to the loss of his Senate seat, and he believed he could better serve the country by remaining in office to continue his work. The facts of the political situation trumped Fulbright's personal views. He signed the Southern Manifesto, a decision that troubled him throughout his career.
I think, one, he was a very practical politician, and two, I don't think that Senator Fulbright ever intended to be halfway thought of as a segregationist. I don't think he was a segregationist. Did he ever lay awake at night figuring out how to keep African Americans from going to school with his children? Of course not. He did not think that way.
And I said to him in a session discussion one time, Mr. Fulbright, you are a great thinker and operator on foreign affairs. That was his forte, foreign affairs. Why do you then vote the party line on civil rights? You're not only a great thinker, but you are a great man in respect to foreign affairs. And why do you do that? He said, Mr. Sutton, before you can be a great man in anything, you got to get elected.
I used to argue, he used to let me argue with him when I was 22 years old. We argued about civil rights all the time. And I don't think that, his civil rights record stands up well in history as anything other than a way to keep getting elected so he could do other good things he could do.
It affected him deeply. It's the only thing that I remember in the long conversations we had almost over a year, this is back a long time ago during the biography of him, that he was uncomfortable about because he felt it would affect him in the future.
Fulbright's apprehension was well-founded. Following his election in 1960, President John F. Kennedy, impressed by Fulbright's thinking on foreign policy, considered the Arkansas senator for the post of Secretary of State. Fulbright's voting record on civil rights prevented his appointment. But Fulbright never wanted the State Department post, since he would lose his senatorial independence to become, in effect, a presidential employee. Even after Kennedy appointed Dean Rusk, who shared Fulbright's distinction as a former Rhodes Scholar, Kennedy continued to value Fulbright's opinion. As the administration plotted to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba, the president sought Fulbright's views. Inviting the senator to accompany him back to Washington from a vacation in Florida, the president took Fulbright into his confidence.
And then on the plane, he said, we're having a meeting at the State Department at 7 o'clock or so. Would you like to come to that? Well, anyway, he went over and he had a press conference, and then we went up to one of the rooms in the State Department, And they were gathered there, 8 or 10 members of the government and some of the top military people, plus Secretary of State, etc. And I was the only member of Congress there.
It's one of the last meetings of the people who were involved in planning this misbegotten expedition. Kennedy invited Fulbright to come. And Kennedy went around the room asking people their opinion as to whether we should go ahead with this. And Bill Fulbright gave a superb presentation saying that this expedition was unconstitutional, that it was illegal, that it violated our treaty obligations, that it wasn't the kind of thing we should be doing as a country, and so on. And I was very much impressed by it. I think that Kennedy was rather impressed by it. And most of the other people in the room were not impressed by it, and the thing went ahead.
Castro, Fulbright said, should be regarded as a thorn in the flesh, but not a dagger in the heart. The Bay of Pigs operation was a military and diplomatic disaster. At a later meeting with leaders and advisors, Kennedy leaned over to Fulbright and in a voice loud enough for others to hear said, "Well, you're the only one who can say, 'I told you so.'" In October 1961, President Kennedy received a report that more military advisors were needed to aid South Vietnam in its civil war against the Communist North. 15 months later, he increased American forces there from 500 to 10,000. Few Americans were focused on that distant conflict, and concern was just beginning among members of Congress.
When I first came to the Senate in 1963, we were already in Vietnam, and I approached Senator Fulbright on the floor one afternoon and asked him if he was concerned about it. And he said, with this kind of ornery variety of humor that he sometimes manifests, he said, "Well, I don't even know where it is." He said, "Do you worry about things like that?" I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I am somewhat concerned about it." He said, "Well, I don't even know how to get to Vietnam. I've never been there." But he said, "I don't know, we got so many things to worry about around here, I just haven't been able to focus on that." And he just kind of dismissed it. Yet I had the feeling that he was listening very carefully to what I had to say. I learned a few days later that he'd told somebody George McGovern was a very good young man. I liked being referred to as young, and also being described by a senior senator as a good man. But it wasn't too long after that that he began asking questions about Vietnam.
In the fall of 1963, Fulbright's growing concern over events in Vietnam was overshadowed by tragedy. The senator had advised President Kennedy to cancel a planned trip to Dallas. Fulbright himself had been subjected to verbal attacks from right-wing elements in Dallas, and he privately told the president he should avoid the city. On the evening of November 22nd, after being sworn in on Air Force One, President Lyndon Johnson arrived at the old Executive Office building in Washington. The first person he met with was his good friend, Bill Fulbright. Johnson knew he could rely on Fulbright to ease the burden thrust upon him so suddenly. Despite their mutual respect, Bill Fulbright and Lyndon Johnson had only two things in common. Both men were from the South. Both were strong politicians with a no-nonsense style.
Lyndon Johnson and Bill Fulbright were different in temperament, heaven knows. I mean, you could not have more different types of personality. Lyndon Johnson was a big, massive, sort of hungry man in private. I mean, he bellowed and roared and told wild stories, but he also was the most formidable political leader that this city has seen as a majority leader. At the same time, and they did have sort of common hunger about making a difference. But Fulbrights tended to be quieter, more scholarly, more thoughtful. At the same time, there was enormous respect on either side.
As majority leader in the Senate, Johnson was so impressed with Fulbright's skill and knowledge of international affairs that he often referred to him as my Secretary of State.
When I'd worked in the Senate, Senator Fulbright was considered a fount of wisdom by LBJ on foreign affairs. Whenever he made a speech on the Senate floor, LBJ would sit there and listen to it from beginning to end, which I don't remember his doing with any other senator.
On August 5, 1964, President Johnson summoned Fulbright and other congressional leaders to an emergency meeting at the White House. North Vietnamese naval vessels had attacked American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. Johnson turned to Fulbright for help. Trusting the president's portrayal of the incidents, Fulbright cooperated closely with the administration, using his position and prestige to help guide a resolution through Congress that gave Johnson authority to respond to the North Vietnamese with military force.
It was a hot August day, and I remember walking over to the Senate floor that day with Gaylord Nelson, my longtime friend in the Senate. He told me that he was worried about the open-ended character of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. He said, I don't want that thing to be an excuse to escalate the war. And I said, well, you know, I have the same worry, and I'm very much concerned about it. Why don't we talk to Fulbright? He said that he had a resolution that he had drafted which amended the resolution to read something like this: nothing in this resolution shall be the occasion for escalating American military involvement in Vietnam. I thought it was perfect. But when we talked to Senator Fulbright about it, he said, look, I agree with that, but if we amend this resolution, it's going to have to go to conference. The House can't take it without a conference. It's going to delay it.